Even amongst the Apaches themselves, Geronimo sort of has this, they see him as the protector, their defender, and then others see him as the reason that they were imprisoned.
100 years after his death, Geronimo is still a controversial figure. His name evokes images of a fierce warrior, a rebel, and a legend.
Personality-wise, many people thought of him as argumentative and talkative and assertive.
He was born in present-day Arizona in 1829 as Goyakla, or one who yawns. Not much is known about Geronimo until the mid-1850s, when one act would forever shape his life. Mexican troops attacked the tribe's camp while Geronimo and other warriors were gone. Among the dead, Geronimo's wife and 3 children.
The Mexicans didn't like the Apaches, and there were some very significant incidents that occurred between Apaches and Mexicans. And in the case of Geronimo, on St. Jerome's Day, he had a major conflict with them, and that led to his being given the name Geronimo by the Mexicans.
Leading a band of Chiricahua Apaches, Geronimo raided towns in Mexico and eventually settlements in the United States.
Like many tribes, they were incensed at their land being taken by the non-Indian encroachment, settlers, the mining industry, the ranchers, the townspeople, politicians, military, all the above. And the plan was to put the Indians on reservations, of course. U.S.
General George Crook was given the task of capturing Geronimo. On several occasions, Geronimo was brought back to the reservation in Arizona, but he always escaped.
And this protracted experience where fully involving 20 years and about 50% of the American Army was becoming a major embarrassment to the Army. And in the 1886 period, political cartoons in Eastern newspapers portrayed young officers at West Point Military Academy being instructed by Geronimo on how many soldiers it took to catch an Apache.
General Crook was relieved of the task, and the military called on General Nelson Miles to rein in the fierce warrior. During the final campaign in 1886, at least 5,000 soldiers and 500 Native Americans were tasked with finding Geronimo. Finally, the Apache warrior surrendered on September 3, 1886. But this time, Geronimo was not taken back to the reservation in Arizona. He and other Apaches would be moved to the East Coast.
But it became clear to General Miles that if one Chiricahua, our Warm Springs Apache, was still in Arizona, there would continue to be a problem. So he decided to make all of them go to Florida as prisoners of war. The only tribe that officially had that status of POWs under the American Army.
The men and women were sent to Fort Marion, but kept in separate prisons. Their children were taken to Pennsylvania.
So everything they held near and dear and everything they functioned by was dismantled during this prison period in Florida and Alabama.
While at Fort Marion, many Apaches died from malaria, tuberculosis, and starvation.
Since these were seacoast forts where these prisons were located, many of the Apaches that died were taken out to sea for sea burials, as they would in the Navy. And as the guards would have to go on across the bay anyway to obtain the supplies and the food for the prisons, and then return to the prisons, all the Apaches saw were taking the dead people out and bringing the food back. And they thought they were eating their own people, so they wouldn't eat.
Military leaders realized something needed to change. After 2 years in Florida, the men and women were moved to Alabama. However, the illness and death continued despite the move. Finally, in 1894, nearly 10 years after Geronimo's surrender, the tribe was moved to Oklahoma.
Fort Sill was sort of a turning point for the Apaches. They were allowed to sort of live in their sort of traditional setup as far as villages, the way that was, and they were allowed to, grow their own crops, and they started raising cattle.
Here, families were reunited and the tribal leaders were restored to their original status. But in a twist of irony, many warriors became soldiers.
You have to understand, even though there are cultural differences between the Army and the warriors, they are basically operating on the same level.
While in Alabama, some tribal members had joined the infantry and they continued their service in the cavalry at Fort Sill. Other members enlisted while on the post and became members of Troop L, 7th Cavalry.
You have all these warriors that fought against the United States, prisoners of war, and now they're soldiers in the U.S. Army. Then they come to Fort Sill. Fort Sill wasn't infantry, it was basically cavalry, transferred. And then they're, escorting payroll, they're doing all the sort of regular things that soldiers do, but yet they're prisoners of war.
Even Geronimo was a member of the cavalry.
Geronimo, because of his fame and notoriety, expected to be treated differently. The Army was determined he would not be treated differently. He wanted to be promoted quicker, more easily. He ought to be elevated automatically. The Army didn't see it that way, and so they made him go through the process like any other male.
While Army officials were determined to treat him like any other soldier, he was given other allowances.
He was sought out nonetheless by presidents and VIPs who came here to Fort Sill, and he participated in President Roosevelt's inauguration parade. He made the Wild West Show circuit.
While he was allowed to travel around the country, he was never set free. The money he earned while traveling with the Wild West Show was just one way he earned a living. He would often charge to have his picture taken by tourists or sell tribal goods.
Geronimo had that sort of aura, and everyone knew he was, and so what he started doing is that he would, sign his name, or have someone sign his name, like made by Geronimo, or Geronimo's cane, or Geronimo's, bow, and, people would just buy it because they saw his name and, instantly made that connection.
While he was famous and sought out by white tourists, some members of his own tribe did not hold him in such high esteem.
Geronimo tended to be played down by some of the other Apaches. He was certainly a person of great respect, a person who had had major impact on their history, but you could look at that in a positive way or a negative way, and some looked at it in a negative way.
Geronimo died on February 17, 1909, as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill. He is buried at the post along with dozens of other Apaches. 5 years after his death, the Apaches were set free.
At the end of the day, you can't change history, but Geronimo, he didn't want to be imprisoned, and he really wanted to live and let his people. He didn't understand why they had to leave. Why do we have to leave our home?